From Washington, D.C., this is Middle East Focus.
Hello, and welcome to Middle East Focus, a weekly podcast on regional affairs and U.S. policy, produced by the Middle East Institute in Washington, D.C. I'm Alistair Taylor, MEI's Editor-In-Chief. On today's program, we'll be talking about the Iranian Revolution of 1979. A seminal event in the history of the modern Middle East, the revolution transformed Iran, and its impact continues to reverberate across the region today, nearly 5 decades on. Brought about the end of the Pahlavi dynasty, ushered in the rise of the Islamic Republic, and fundamentally reshaped Iran's relationship with its neighbors and key external powers like the US. You can subscribe to Middle East Focus on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and other podcast providers. To discuss this important issue, I'm joined today by two great guests, Alex Vatanka and Andrew Scott Cooper. Alex is a senior fellow at MEI and the director of the Institute's Iran program. He's also the author of, most recently, The Battle of the Ayatollahs in Iran, the United States, Foreign Policy and Political Rivalry since 1979. Andrew is a non-resident scholar at the Middle East Institute and teaches as an adjunct professor at International Hellenic University in Thessaloniki, Greece. He's written several books, including The Fall of Heaven, Pahlavis and the Final Days of Imperial Iran. Alex, Andrew, welcome to the podcast, and thank you both very much for joining us today.
Great to be with you, Alistair.
Thanks for having us.
Andrew, let's dive right in. It's been nearly a half century since the Iranian Revolution of 1979. Why is it important to study it now, 45 years later, and how has the revolution shaped today's Middle East?
I tend to look at the Middle East as divided into the before and the after the revolution. So 1979 is a hinge year for understanding the region, not only Iran, but the area. And I think the revolution continues to be a source of great fascination and interest for Iranians, but also for scholars, because we're still trying to understand the causes of the revolution and how the Shah lost control. The revolution marked at least the temporary end of a trend of Western-style modernization in Iran and the region, and it was overtaken by the Islamization, which had been, of course, that was a trend that had started after World War II. So the revolution continues to be very important, and I think as far as many Iranians are concerned, it's possibly not even finished yet because of the debates that go on about the legitimacy of this regime and the causes of the revolution.
Alex, can you give our listeners a sort of brief snapshot of the situation in Iran in the run-up to the revolution? Where did things stand politically, economically, and in its relations with the US and other key regional actors?
Alice, let me just, if you don't mind, sort of share a little family background. So when the revolution happened, I was 4 years old, so I can hardly claim to have been among those revolutionaries on either side in that conflict, nor was my family politically involved. But the reality is a good part of Iranian society, for whatever reason, which I'm sure we get into, in 1979 decided that they wanted change. Now, the coalition against the Shah was this large movement, including various different types of political thinking and personalities, from the Islamists on the one hand to the Tudeh party, communists, secular nationalists. It was vast. And Iran, in the 15, 20 years prior to 1979, had experienced quite a lot of political turmoil. On the one hand, the Shah was facing plenty of opposition, but it would be wrong to say Iran didn't experience, as Andrew just pointed out, much modernization at the same time. So you had this sort of strange phenomena where the country was actually modernizing, doing so much better than the generation before. And yet there was this restlessness. And that restlessness didn't come from one particular part of society, it came from different parts of society for different reasons. And what really happens in 79 is this cleric by the name of Ayatollah Khomeini, for whatever reason, is able to sort of become the leader of a movement. He says the right things. He promises all sorts of wonderful benefits for society to come once the Shah's regime is replaced, manages to pull it off. The revolution is successfully executed, if you will. The Shah leaves the country. And the last 44 years, Iranian society has essentially been scratching its head going, what just happened? What did just happen? So again, we can discuss I mean, the Shah was certainly not a Democrat, and you could point to that as one of the reasons so many were alienated. His economic policies were wonderful for many, but the reality is, while society as a whole benefited and improved, modernized, there were plenty who still did not have enough, and that was a reason for them to come to the streets. Then you had the religious-minded folks who looked at modernization from their perspective. So the list goes on. Well, what I really think is the message of 79 is, and I think that's the story when I talk to Iranians today, is Iranians didn't know what on earth they were getting themselves into. And by the time they realized that they had just replaced 2,500 years of monarchy with something called the Islamic Republic that was work in progress, again, to Andrew's point, it's still evolving. I mean, what is the Islamic Republic today? So to me, it was arguably the biggest collective mistake that the Iranian nation committed. Certainly that generation that was adults and their eyes open in 1979. And to this day, they seem to be thinking about it and regretting it. At least many are regretting what happened.
Andrew, Alex touched on it briefly, but I kind of want to circle back and ask you in a little bit more detail about Ayatollah Khomeini and how he was perceived in the years before the revolution. How was he viewed by the government, by the broader population, and also by other senior Shia clerics?
He had made a bid for power in 1963, so he was well known to the political establishment, the security forces, and certainly the senior clerics, and they really feared him. And after he was dispatched and sent into exile, first to Turkey and then to Iraq, he sort of disappeared. You were not allowed to mention his name in public in the newspapers or the news television. You weren't allowed to display his photograph. So he became a sort of romantic figure for young Iranian intellectuals, students, leftists. And it really wasn't until mid-1970s that he became the focal point for opposition groups. And as Alex said, Khomeini said many things that were appealing to moderate, middle-class, liberal urban reformers. For example, during the unrest, he said he favored a French-style republic. He was saying, you'll never have to pay an electricity bill again. You won't have to pay for water, populist things like that. But certainly by late 1977, he was emerging as a threat again. And the regime, the Shah, made a very disastrous decision by approving a public attack on him by this newspaper article that said he was a scurrilous figure. And that made it okay for people to mention his name in public again. But when you mention this, the senior clerics, they really feared him because they knew him and they knew what his ultimate agenda was. He had actually published all his ideas in a series of speeches he gave in 1970, which was published as a thesis on Islamic government. So it's not as though his ultimate ambition was not known, even to the regime. The Shah was specifically warned. This person, he's in exile, but he is propagating a message that's very extreme and very dangerous. I think that one sign of just how fearful the senior clerics like Grand Ayatollah Shariat Madari were is that in the spring of 1978, he spoke to a senior official in Savak, the Shah's internal security force, and basically asked him said, we think that you need to eliminate him. You need to remove him from the scene now, which was a code for assassination, because they were so worried about what would happen if he did actually come to power. And there were these opportunities to remove him and eliminate him, and they weren't taken. So that is one lesson that the Islamic Republic, the people who assumed power, took power after the Shah, they learned that lesson themselves, is to eliminate any rivals or successors who are emerging on the scene, politically or on the religious sense.
Alex, given the widespread unrest in Iran in the late 70s that you referenced earlier, do you think some sort of dramatic upheaval or revolution was inevitable? Could things have gone a different way?
There were so many different moving parts to this. You had an economy that had done really well in a few years prior to 1979. Inflation was becoming an issue. A lot of people were suffering on the economic front for inflation reasons. There was the issue of corruption that was always a factor. The Shah's inner circle was certainly guilty of corruption, and the Shah knew so much, tried to deal with it. He just didn't have the time. You had also personal level issues. The Shah was suffering with cancer. His will to fight on wasn't there. You could point to the international scene. There was a new president in the White House, Jimmy Carter. The Shah famously did not trust the Democratic Party when it came to its relations with Iran. You had, the impact of the sort of international mood at the time. Andrew was talking about the young. This was very much the revolution of the young. And what were the young really, in many ways, shaped by or driven by? And things like the anti-war movement in the West when it came to the Vietnam War. Sort of many on the left, on the international left, were anti-American in essence. And amazing thing is Khomeini was getting support from leftist European intellectuals. And it's quite amazing when we think about it almost 45 years later that was the case. But again, to Andrew's point, this romantic vision that very different groups of people had about Khomeini, that this man will be the symbolic leader of a revolution against what people call the tyrant, the Shah. And once the Shah is gone, Iran's going to have something that looks like a European democracy. Oil money starts being distributed equally, and people will have freedom to live the way they want, pray the way they want, all the rest of it. It was just utopia that was being sold to people. Now, as soon as the revolution was done by February of 1979 and the Shah was in exile, within a few weeks, who were the first people in the streets? The women of Iran. Why? Because suddenly they've been forced to live a certain way. The mandatory hijab was being discussed, and that was just the first one. And then you've seen the next few years, Iran essentially descending to something that started looking like civil war conditions, because Khomeini and his people had been very set. They're going to lie. They're going to get power. Once they had power, they want to be ruthless as they had to be, and they were. And they crushed everyone. And that's basically been the modus operandi, first of Ayatollah Khomeini and his successor from 1989, present-day Supreme Leader Ali Khamenei. That's the modus operandi. No compromises, no showing weakness. Crush any kind of dissent at any cost. Where we are today is, if you listen to Iranian media, Iranian officials inside the Iranian regime, they're increasingly asking tough questions. What was the 79 revolution about, and where are we today? So, for example, to just put something very timely on the table, this enmity with the United States, this idea that Israel has to be wiped off the face of the map, and two pillars of Iranian foreign policy today, which is costing Iran deeply, deeply in terms of isolation, in terms of financial costs, sanctions, you name it. Where did that come from? That wasn't part of the deal in 1979. Getting a fight with the United States was never really mentioned by anybody in 1979. Being friends with Communist Party of China or Vladimir Putin of today, these are the type of awkward realities that the regime is wrestling with today. And frankly, they don't have good answers. So they go back to what they know best, which is, if you ask tough questions of them, if you criticize them, what you will get is you'll be crushed. If you're not willing to be silenced, you will be crushed. And that's why the Islamic Republic today, 45 years later, is in power. Not because it has legitimized itself, not because it has broadened the base. In fact, the opposite has happened. The revolutionary tent today is far smaller than it was in 1979. And those people who are behind the revolutionary cause to this day basically are not there because they're necessarily believers, because that's where the paycheck comes in. And they don't know any other way of making a living.
Also, if I can just add to that, after the revolution, the people who took power in Iran, conducted a lot of studies to understand how the Shah lost power himself, because the Islamic Republic is the 27th Iranian dynasty, and they don't want there to be a 28th dynasty. So the point is to stay in power. And one thing that they will tell you, when I was in Iran, they will say that the Shah's decision to liberalize starting in the spring of 1976 created the opportunity for them, opposition groups, to launch this mass mobilization against the regime. And even Shah's defenders will say that liberalization was very poorly handled. This is why when you've seen in the past, so every few years in Iran, these upsurges in unrest, you will see people being allowed to protest to a certain extent, and then they're crushed. The crackdown comes very hard, very fast, and that is because they watched in disbelief starting in the summer of 77 and through 78, where they were allowed to conduct protests and go into the streets. And there was this explosion of unrest in Tabriz in February 78. And the Iranian army did not crack down. The Shah feared being seen as a king who would cause bloodshed in the streets. And during the unrest and worst of the unrest in October 78, he told his generals, if you have to open fire, shoot below the knee. Well, that is sending messages of ambivalence, hesitancy, and paralysis. And so the Islamic Republic today, we've seen just recently that they will draw blood because they don't want to ever be seen as weak or hesitant in their response to popular unrest. They're not ever going to go down the route that the Shah did in 78.
So you see that as a sort of direct historical kind of lesson learned by the current Iranian leadership from the way the Shah dealt with the protests in the run-up to the revolution?
Absolutely. When I was in Iran, I visited Ayatollah Mohammad Ali Gharami, who was living a nice, quiet life in Qom, and we had a chat, and I asked him, he was very close to Khomeini before and then during the revolution, and I asked him, when did you think the Pahlavi dynasty was finished? And I was expecting him to say Jaleh Square, the shootings at Jaleh Square, or some incident in 78. But he said, actually, I was in prison in 76, and he said, when we were in prison, that is the followers of Khomeini, the main agitators and troublemakers, we were so fearful of Savak that we didn't look each other in the eyes when we were in prison. And then we remember one day, someone from the International Committee for the Red Cross came through, and suddenly we were being handed Qurans, and suddenly we were being given better food, and the conditions in the prison improved. Now, it's really interesting. The Shah was doing that in response to concerns expressed by the international human rights community, the United States, etc. What Ayatollah Gharami said, the message that the political and religious agitators, the extremists in prison, took from that was that the regime was now weak, and this was going to be their chance to take direct action. So they saw that as appeasement and weakness. And the senior Savak officials who I interviewed said exactly the same thing. The Savak official who was in charge of internal security in Iran went to the empress and said, this is going to backfire on us. And according to him, she said, well, you told us there were going to be problems and nothing's happened. And he said, but you've turned the prisons into hotels. So that's another lesson they've learned as you hear these stories come out of the Iranian prisons today about the absolute brutality. Well, there's a reason for that. You won't see the ICRC allowed into a prison in the Islamic Republic.
Alex, curious to get your thoughts on this point as well. What else do you see as the sort of lessons learned by the current leadership from the revolution and the kind of experience, the run up to that, other than brutality, repression, use of force? What else do you see as kind of lessons learned for them?
Look, Khamenei is very clear that he believes that strength, power is the way forward. That's how he has dealt with consolidating power in Iran himself since 1989. And he's been ruthless. He took out essentially the guy who made him supreme leader, Ayatollah Rafsanjani. And he just recently has disqualified Hassan Rouhani, someone who's been at his side for pretty much since 1979. I mean, he doesn't hold back. He has been the most ruthless of figures in the Islamic Republic. In terms of another lesson one could point to, I don't think Khamenei cares much what the world thinks of him. He really doesn't, what the West thinks of him. I mean, the Shah was worried about his image. He did toy with the idea of pleasing the Western public opinion in terms of his image. And that turned out to be a mistake. And by the way, there's a lesson here for international organizations. They got into Iran at the time, to Andrew's point about visiting prisons and so forth. They meant well, but they didn't understand what the society where they were coming into. They certainly didn't understand the worldview of the Islamists, because nobody did. Frankly, nobody did. I mean, we had never had up until 1979, a theocracy, the way the Islamic Republic became. It's a whole worldview, both in terms of how you run domestically, how you run your affairs on an international stage. So as we look at Iran today, and people are talking about the end of the Islamic Republic, the day after, what comes, and so on, we've got to be very careful, both Iranians and the rest of the world. You've got to understand what you're dealing with. And if there's one lesson learned from 1979, is that if you want to replace something without having a clear idea what's going to come in, then you're making a strategic mistake. That's basically what happened in 1979. And everyone's guilty of that. I mean, the Shah was guilty of that. He could have prevented that revolution had he acted earlier, had he liberalized, again, to Andrew's point, perhaps more cautiously. He basically, at the end of it, was seen as someone who didn't have the will to fight. And when you are the top at that pyramid and you are not seen to be willing to fight, that was the cue for the generals, for everybody else in society. So you see, a year before the fall of the Shah's regime, that people were packing their bags, selling their houses, and leaving. That is something also that Khamenei has learned. Now, Khamenei doesn't care that folks that aren't supporters of the regime, they leave. He doesn't care about capital flight, brain drain, none of that matters. What matters to him is the base. He wants the base to believe that he's still firm. So, for example, let's take the issue of the mandatory hijab. In a country where women, vast majority of women, are against mandatory hijab, it's not something they like, they're against it for whatever political reasons, personal reasons, religious reasons. Khamenei is saying, nope, I want you to have the hijab on your heads. And officials might be turning to him saying, sir, when we have to police 50% of our population, the women, this is going to cost us a lot. We're diverting resources away from other important things. But Khamenei says, well, if you start giving in on the mandatory hijab, if you compromise on that, tomorrow they're going to be knocking on your door asking for another compromise. And the day after for another compromise. And next thing you know, the Islamic Republic has started loosening up the way the Shah did. And that's when you might lose control over the process, and that might just bring the whole system down. Khamenei learned that lesson because he was there. He was a revolutionary. And what he's doing is the opposite. Tight control. He wants the succession process to happen. We don't know who he wants as his successor. It might be his son or someone else, but he wants to make sure he's got tight grip, that he passes on the baton to the next person, and that becomes his legacy. Obviously, the day he's dead, he's done his job, but you see right now, that's what he's worried about, making sure he gives something to the next person that might follow him, as opposed to experimenting with meeting the Iranian people halfway, which might be a slippery slope and might just bring the regime down.
We've focused a lot so far on domestic factors and kind of through lines from 79 to now, but I want to turn a little bit to discuss the role of external actors and also kind of the impact on foreign policy of Iran. Andrew, what role did the U.S. play in the events leading up to the revolution? And I think we touched on Jimmy Carter briefly earlier, but do you think if somebody other than Carter were in the White House at the time, would that have made any difference?
I think this was essentially an internal Iranian, described as a power struggle or crisis, internal crisis, regime crisis, and societal crisis that had been building up for some time. It certainly didn't help when you have the president's own advisors so divided over whether to offer the Shah support or whether to press him for more reforms in the middle of mass unrest, which is always a dangerous thing. They didn't understand themselves what was going on in Iran. The US embassy made some serious mistakes all the way through. One of them was to open so-called secret meetings. I don't know how secret they were, meetings with members of the so-called moderate Islamist opposition parties in early 1978. But by then it was too late. And that sent the signal to the moderate Islam, Mr. Bazargan, for example, who was the leader of a group called the Liberation Movement of Iran. He was someone with really only marginal influence. But it gave them an inflated sense of who they were and convinced them that if the Shah left, the Americans would deal with them. And of course, the Khomeini movement was ready to overwhelm them as soon as the revolution happened, and did overwhelm them. The Shah was convinced that the Americans were conspiring against him. Actually, they were so disorganized all the way through. And they failed to understand the whole phenomenon of Islamization moving through the region, even after the Shah had left in early February 1979. Brzezinski, the national security advisor, wrote the president a memo and said, and I quote, and this is underlined, by the way, quote, "We should be careful not to overgeneralize from the Iranian case. Islamist revivalist movements are not sweeping the Middle East and are not likely to be the wave of the future." Now, the United States had been heavily invested in Iran since the 1940s. Americans had poured in tens of billions of dollars in economic aid, military firepower. There were 50,000 Americans living in the country at the time of the revolution. Not only did they not understand who the Shah was, but they didn't really understand Iran. And so that was the American component there. And it's a depressing story, really, because Iran has gone from being America's most reliable ally in the Middle East to being the biggest foe of United States foreign policy. And it's drained both countries of national treasure and resources.
Just on Andrew's point, if I could just add to that, I think, when I think back, the billions of dollars that the Shah, certainly in the 70s, was spending, that was Iranian money being used to buy American weaponry. That was all great. The Shah turned around and made Iran, I think it was the fifth largest military in the world at the time. But the fact is, he really never communicated to his people why he was doing that. And I'm not even sure if he had a good message for that. This idea that Iran, that was essentially in the developing world, was going to become America's policeman in the Middle East sounds great for the Shah in his conversation with fellow world leaders. But the fact is, those billions of dollars could have been used, I think, more wisely at the time. It didn't have to be so excessive. When you compare to, for example, what Korea went through after the Korean War, the United States stayed in South Korea, but helped turn a very poor South Korean economy, one of the poorest countries at the time in the 50s, to what it is today. And it's only now that the Koreans are starting to wander into the realm of military production and affairs. The same kind of thing can be said about what the US helped Japan do, become an economic miracle. And I think that was much better way of dealing with those countries, with those partners, than what the US ended up doing with Iran, where focus was so heavily on the military side of things. And the economy, as I said before, was improving, was modernizing, but not enough. And not enough Iranians were involved and benefited. And if that had been handled better, I just wonder if the poor class that essentially rose up against the Shah in the 79, the working class, the intellectual class had for a long time had grievances against the Shah for intellectual reasons. The working class really joined the revolution when they started feeling the inflation was really hitting them in their pockets. And the Shah and the United States, being the main backer of the Shah, could have handled that situation better by focusing more on a fair economic situation in Iran.
Alex, to that point, though, I would say spending large amounts of money on a sort of military first regional foreign policy project that ignores the perspective and priorities of people at home sounds pretty similar to the situation Iran finds itself in today. I know when we talk about the change between, the Shah's foreign policy and the Islamic republics, we often focus on the differences. But what do you see as the kind of continuities or through lines there?
No, I think you're exactly right, Alistair. I think what the Khamenei regime and the Revolutionary Guards are doing in the region is absolutely the case where they're forgetting the homeland. They're forgetting poor provinces like Sistan and Baluchistan or Kurdistan, where there's low-intensity militant campaigns by disgruntled local populations against the central government in Tehran. So Khamenei is doing the same mistake because he's got also, in his own ways, this sort of grand idea of his place in the world stage. Now, he's not in the region right now. The axis of resistance that he has invested so much in. If you ask ordinary Iranians today, the generation that wasn't born in 79, didn't experience the Iran-Iraq war, they would ask the question, the axis of resistance is here to do what for me as a jobless young person in Iran who's just desperately trying to emigrate to the West? How is axis of resistance helping me? And that's a real problem for the regime. What they're doing right now from Lebanon to Yemen, might make sense for a lot of strategists in the West, in the sense that this, described as Iran trying to be the hegemonic power in the region. But for ordinary Iranians in Iran, it doesn't make sense. Unless you are a hardcore supporter of the regime, the Iranian regional policies, including anti-Americanism, the position that they have on Israel, just doesn't make sense. That's something ought to be of deep concern for Khamenei, the Revolutionary Guards. They know they're on slippery grounds here. They know under, I should say, thin ice, because just recently, as we witnessed the United States strike pro-Iranian militant groups in Syria and in Iraq, what was the Iranian reaction? It wasn't to go on the offensive, opposite. Reportedly, they've been saying to their proxy allies in the region to de-escalate because Khamenei knows he can't afford a war with the United States. But that still doesn't take away the question of why bring the country to the brink of war? He could have focused on economic development. He could have focused on de-escalation. He could have even taken a different approach to helping the Palestinian people in their fight against Israel by taking a less militant, less sort of non-compromising stance on the issue of Israel's right to exist than he has adopted. And I think the root causes here all go back to 1979. This was the world's first militant Islamist regime that was born after that revolution. And again, to reiterate, Khamenei's lesson that he learned was just stay the course. If you have to be ruthless, be ruthless. Don't compromise. That's been his approach to running Iranian society at home. He's taken the same approach in the region, but as we're seeing right now, with a bit of pushback from the United States, he's stepping back, at least for now. His long-term mission is the same ideological dream of kicking the United States out of the Middle East, but he's proven to also be open to being pressured to tone it down when the cost of not doing so is too much for him to pay.
We're running short on time, but before we wrap up, I want to get your concluding thoughts. Andrew, what do you see as the lasting legacy of the revolution, and why is it resonant today?
Before he died, the Shah predicted that the day would come when the people of Iran would regret their decision to force him from power. And I think the Iranian experience since 1979 confirms the old adage that revolutions rarely turn out well. So in that sense, the Islamic Republic and the revolution will be remembered as a utopian experiment that failed. I also think it's fair to conclude that the next Iran will be one that is more secular, more Persian, and more socially progressive in its orientation. And the irony, of course, is that it will in fact be more reflective of the Shah's vision of Iran than the vision put forward by Ayatollah Khamenei.
Alex, you've got the last word here. Any final thoughts?
Well, I mean, when I look at 1979 and the failed promises of 1979 and the fact that the country today experiences a major crisis of immigration, lack of hope. I just heard a speech by a former Iranian foreign minister, Ali Akbar Salehi. I mean, this is a man who studied at MIT, has lived in Europe, lived in America, lived in Latin America, who lived in the Arab world, hardly somebody who didn't know the world. And yet he went and supported the Islamic Republic, became its foreign minister. And today he's sitting in Tehran and openly saying, I have information that Iranian parents are looking to send their kids away abroad from the age of kindergarten. I mean, from kindergarten age, they're looking to emigrate. These are not people that don't have money. They have money. They have money enough to be able to choose to leave, and they are choosing to leave. I don't know what else you want as evidence that the revolution has failed. I don't know what else you need to point to other than saying this is the world's first modern theocracy that has been there for 45 years. And today the evidence shows that millions of Iranians are not leaving political Islam as a political platform. They're leaving the religion of Islam. I don't know else would beat that as evidence that Khamenei and his system felt that they just needed to hang on to the core, and they still have a core. They have about 15, 20% of the Iranian society for one reason or another behind them. But the vast majority of Iranian public has left this regime and is showing it through different expressions. That's all the evidence you need to be able to very clearly determine that this is a failed revolution, at least now.
We'll have to leave things there for now, but Alex, Andrew, thank you both very much for joining us today.
Thank you, Alistair.
Thank you.
That's all the time we have for this week. Thank you to our listeners for tuning in, and to our podcast editor, Elliot Sanders, for all of his work on this week's episode. You can find our latest coverage of Iran and regional developments on our website at www.mei.edu. And you can follow MEI on X, Instagram, Facebook, and YouTube, and subscribe to our email newsletters for the latest analysis and information about upcoming events. I'm Alistair Taylor. We will see all of you next week.
This has been a presentation of the Middle East Institute. To support MEI's programs and podcasts, please donate at www.mei.edu. Thank you for your support.